The certified notice didn't ask. It commanded. I had until midnight to rip down the tiny lens under my porch eaves because the board suddenly decided home surveillance breached community standards. Non-compliance meant an immediate, property-threatening lawsuit. I left the camera exactly where it was, flipped the night vision mode to maximum contrast, and kept my eyes on the live digital stream. When the motion sensor pinged at 3:14 a.m., the shadow slipping through my bushes didn't belong to a neighborhood vandal. It was the HOA president herself, crouching low, using an industrial crowbar to pry open my home's structural crawlspace hatch while tracking a faded, handheld blueprint. What lay hidden beneath my floorboards that a wealthy suburban dictator was willing to risk a felony to uncover. The foundation of my home wasn't poured in 2012 like the rest of Copper Creek Estates. It was hand-carved out of local limestone in 1884, when a megadeveloper bought the surrounding valley's historic orchards to construct 200 identical colonial-style properties. My late grandfather flatly refused to sell our family's original homestead. After he passed away, the property came to me, along with a complex, exhausting legal compromise. The old house was officially grandfathered into the newly formed subdivision, making me an involuntary member of a homeowners association that desperately wished my home did not exist. My life matched the quiet precision required by my profession. As a digital archivist, I spent my weeks restoring severely degraded historical documents and mapping century-old property deeds for the county museum. It was solitary, meticulous work that trained my eyes to notice microscopic details, faded ink on parchment, subtle shifts in old boundary lines, and the quiet rhythm of our neighborhood. My daily routine was entirely unremarkable. I brewed coffee at sunrise, tended to the surviving heirloom apple trees in my backyard, and kept the old house meticulously clean to avoid giving the board any ammunition. The face of the community's hostility belonged to Victoria Vance. Victoria lived 3 doors down in a house that looked exactly like every other property on the street, save for the pristine, chemical-treated perfection of her lawn. She was a retired administrative clerk who possessed an almost biological need for systemic order. Under her leadership, the HOA operated less like a neighborhood committee and more like an aggressive corporate restructuring firm. Victoria didn't just walk the neighborhood. She patrolled it with an absolute sense of ownership, carrying a digital clipboard and a laser distance measurer to ensure every mailbox stood exactly 42 inches above the pavement. To Victoria, my home was an offensive blemish on her perfect landscape. It was too tall, the original cedar siding was too rustic, and the ancient stone foundation didn't match the uniform poured concrete of her empire. For 3 years, our relationship was defined by a cold, silent standoff. She would stand at the edge of my gravel driveway, staring at my porch with her arms crossed, waiting for a single leaf to remain unraked or a window screen to show a tear. I counteracted her hostility with absolute, flawless compliance, studying the 100-page rulebook better than the board members themselves. The dynamic shifted when the Town Planning Board announced a major infrastructure expansion, a new municipal water main that would require surveying the deep subterranean lines running beneath our valley. While the news barely registered with my neighbors, it triggered an immediate, frantic wave of activity at the HOA headquarters. Suddenly, the board became intensely interested in the exact structural footprint of my grandfather's old house. Victoria began showing up at odd hours, not to check my grass height, but to casually ask about the old property deeds and what lay beneath the floorboards. When I politely declined to share my family's private historical maps, her demeanor hardened into something cold and predatory. The friendly neighborhood check-ins vanished overnight, replaced by a sudden, aggressive rewrite of the community safety bylaws. A new amendment was rushed through the board, quietly targeting a brand new violation: the immediate prohibition of any unapproved external electronic fixtures on historical facades. I didn't think much of it until I looked at the tiny, motion-activated security lens I had just mounted under my front eaves to protect my archived files. The trap was being laid, but neither of us realized who would end up caught in it. The official opening move of Victoria's campaign didn't arrive in a standard envelope. It was delivered by a private courier who forced me to sign a digital receipt before handing over a thick, wax-sealed folder. Inside was a document titled Emergency Directive for the Preservation of Community Character. The language was dense, wrapped in layers of aggressive legal jargon, but the core message was unmistakable. The board claimed that my newly installed porch camera, an ultra-wide definition security lens, violated a newly minted subsection of the bylaws regarding the unapproved installation of electronic fixtures on historical facades. Because my house was grandfathered into the neighborhood, they were using its historic status as a weapon against me, arguing that the modern black plastic of the camera housing disrupted the visual continuity of the street. I was given exactly 48 hours to remove the device or face a recurring daily fine of $450. I sat at my archiving desk that evening, turning the document over in my hands. The hypocrisy was staggering. Just 2 doors down, a board member had installed a massive, rotating satellite dish on his modern roof without a single word of protest from the committee. My camera was smaller than a deck of cards, tucked deeply beneath the shadow of the porch eaves, painted in a matte shade that perfectly matched the aged cedar trim. It was completely invisible to anyone driving past. Its only sin was that it pointed directly across the small strip of grass separating my driveway from the community's common property line. Instead of compliance, I chose meticulous observation. As a digital archivist, I was trained to look past the surface of things to find the underlying intent. I kept the camera active, calibrated its motion filters to ignore the swaying branches of the heirloom apple trees, and pushed the feed directly to a dedicated local server in my basement. If Victoria wanted to penalize me for protecting my home, she would have to prove the camera was causing actionable harm to the community. What followed was a rapid, calculated escalation of bureaucratic psychological warfare. Within a week, the single white envelope became a daily deluge. The HOA's legal team began searching for any conceivable infraction to break my financial resolve. I received a $500 fine because my gravel driveway allegedly contained non-uniform stone sizes that fractured the visual harmony of the asphalt street. 2 days later, a $300 penalty was assessed because a sudden thunderstorm had shaken loose a cluster of unharvested apples, which fell onto my own grass, an event the board officially classified as an unmanaged organic waste accumulation. The harassment soon moved from paper to physical presence. Victoria's white electric golf cart became a permanent fixture at the edge of my property line. She would sit there for 30 minutes at a time, the silent motor humming quietly as she held up a laser distance measurer, aiming the bright red dot directly at my windows, my siding, and my porch. It was an intentional display of absolute surveillance, a message that my life was under a microscope. The turning point of my frustration occurred when the board authorized the use of a commercial quadcopter drone for community-wide roof inspections. It was a complete fabrication of a necessity, funded entirely by a special assessment tax levied on the residents. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, the high-pitched, angry buzzing of the drone's rotors would echo directly outside my second-story bedroom window. The device would hover just 3 feet from the glass, its high-definition lens tilting up and down, ostensibly checking the integrity of my historic cedar shingles, but practically invading the absolute privacy of my sanctuary. Every time I stepped outside to confront the operator, the drone would zip away over the tree canopy, retreating back to the safety of Victoria's backyard. The constant tension began to take a heavy emotional toll. The sanctuary I had inherited from my grandfather felt less like a home and more like a besieged fortress. The simple act of checking my physical mailbox induced a wave of sharp, tight anxiety in my chest, wondering what absurd corporate fine would be waiting for me next. My savings were being steadily eroded by the administrative fees required just to file formal appeals with a board that acted as judge, jury, and executioner. I felt entirely helpless against an entity that possessed unlimited funds and zero accountability. But while Victoria was focusing her energy on making my daily life a living nightmare, my professional life provided the exact tool I needed to fight back. That month, the county museum tasked me with a massive digitization project, scanning and indexing the original subterranean structural surveys of the valley from the late 19th century. These were the foundational blue ink plat maps drawn up before the orchards were planted. long before the modern developers poured the first drop of concrete for Copper Creek Estates. As I processed the high-resolution scans, cleaning up the faded ink and aligning the ancient geographic coordinates with modern satellite telemetry, I noticed a massive, glaring anomaly. The modern subdivision maps provided by the HOA claimed that the community's primary common area, a manicured park containing the neighborhood's main auxiliary high-pressure utility junction, ended exactly 3 feet before my property line. But the original 1884 deed for my grandfather's homestead told an entirely different story. The actual boundary line didn't stop at the driveway. It extended 20 feet further east, slicing directly through the center of that utility junction. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs as I traced the subterranean paths. The developers hadn't just built near my family's land. When they constructed the modern subdivision in 2012, they had illegally routed the entire neighborhood's high-pressure graywater filtration loop and auxiliary gas conduits directly through the deep, hand-carved limestone crawlspace cavern beneath my historic home. They had hidden the infrastructure behind a false stone wall in my cellar before my grandfather signed the grandfathering agreement, completely omitting it from the modern property disclosures. The pieces of the puzzle instantly slammed together with terrifying clarity. The upcoming municipal water main expansion wasn't just a routine town project. The town surveyors were going to map the underground lines with ground-penetrating radar. If they discovered that the HOA's critical infrastructure was running illegally through a private, grandfathered historic foundation, the entire subdivision's operational permits would be revoked, the board would face millions of dollars in structural relocation costs, and Victoria's administrative career would be completely destroyed. Victoria didn't want my security camera gone because it was an eyesore. She wanted it gone because the lens was positioned perfectly to cover the low, wooden exterior hatch that led directly into that subterranean limestone crawlspace. She needed access to my cellar to alter or obscure the illegal utility connections before the town engineers arrived, and my camera was the only thing stopping her from slipping into the darkness unnoticed. Instead of revealing my discovery, I decided to give her exactly what she wanted, but on my own terms. I sent a formal email to the board stating that I would power down the porch camera's visible blue status light to comply with the community's aesthetic guidelines. To the casual observer, the lens looked completely dead, a useless piece of plastic dangling from the wood trim. In reality, I had rewired the internal components to run on a completely silent, invisible infrared night vision spectrum. The camera was wider awake than it had ever been, recording the pitch-black perimeter of my house in razor-sharp, heat-signature clarity. I sat in my dark office, the monitors casting a pale glow across my face, waiting for the trap to spring. The legal deadline for the camera's removal was set for midnight, and as the clock ticked past the hour, the neighborhood fell into an unnerving, absolute silence. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the local server on my desk vibrated with a single, high-priority silent notification. A heat signature had just crossed the grass line. I looked at the live stream, expecting to see a rogue animal or perhaps a hired contractor. Instead, a familiar silhouette emerged from the deep shadows of the apple trees. It was Victoria Vance, breathing heavily in the cold air, carrying a heavy iron crowbar in one hand and a faded handheld blueprint in the other, stepping directly toward the hidden hatch of my foundation. The digital interface on my primary monitor didn't blink. It recorded the erratic, jerky movements of the figure outside in the grayscale contrast of high-definition infrared. Victoria Vance had discarded her signature neon safety vest, replacing it with a heavy, dark canvas utility jacket that swallowed the ambient moonlight. She wasn't walking the sidewalk with her digital clipboard anymore. She was crouching in the mud between my heirloom apple trees, her breathing visible on my screen as small, jagged plumes of white thermal energy. I didn't call the local police department. Experience had taught me that a local trespass complaint would simply result in a polite warning, a bureaucratic slap on the wrist, and a mountain of deniable paperwork from the HOA's expensive legal defense fund. Instead, 4 hours earlier, I had utilized my county museum credentials to contact 2 very specific individuals, the chief regional inspector for the State Utilities Commission and the senior investigator for the Environmental Protection Division. Both men were currently sitting in absolute silence on wooden archival crates inside my damp, limestone cellar, surrounded by centuries of preserved paper and the steady, low hum of my local servers. From the floorboards directly beneath our feet, the first sound of physical violence against the house echoed through the dark cellar. It was the dry, agonizing screech of an iron crowbar forcing its way into the seams of the 1884 oak hatch. The old wood resisted, splitting slightly along the grain, sending a shudder through the foundation stones. In the dark of the basement, the state inspector turned his head toward me, the faint green glow from his digital camera screen illuminating the grim, professional set of his jaw. I signaled him to wait. A second, more violent metallic thud reverberated through the masonry. The ancient iron latch on the outside of the hatch sheared off entirely, dropping into the soft mud with a dull slap. Cold winter air instantly rushed into the cellar through the newly formed opening, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth, wet canvas, and the metallic tang of old oil. First came Victoria's flashlight, a hyper-focused, tactical LED beam that sliced through the darkness of the cellar, sweeping across the rows of storage boxes, completely missing the corner where the three of us stood frozen in the deep shadows. Then, the rolled-up, faded blueprint she had been carrying was tossed through the opening, landing squarely on the dirt floor. The leather of her winter boots squeaked aggressively against the exterior stone as she began to back her way down into the hatch, her legs dangling into the cavernous basement as she felt blindly for the rungs of the old wooden ladder. The moment her feet touched the bottom rung, I reached out and threw the master breaker switch for my high-intensity archival studio lamps. The cellar transformed instantly from a pitch-black tomb into a blinding, 10,000-lumen operating room. The sheer intensity of the specialized lighting bounced off the white limestone walls, erasing every shadow and projecting a sterile, unforgiving glare directly into the center of the room. Victoria froze mid-step, her hands still gripping the upper frame of the oak hatch. Her eyes, dilated completely by the midnight darkness, snapped shut against the agonizing brightness. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her head jerking backward as she instinctively threw her arm over her face to shield her vision. For 3 years, she had used light as a weapon, shining flashlights into my windows, aiming laser measures at my siding, and flying surveillance drones outside my bedroom window. Now, the light belonged entirely to me. When she finally managed to blink through the glare, her gaze didn't lock onto me. It locked onto the uniform patch of the state utilities inspector standing directly to my left, and the flashing recording lens of the environmental investigator on my right. The complete, instantaneous drain of color from her face was absolute. Her skin turned the exact shade of the chalky limestone dust coating the floorboards. I stepped forward, picked up the rolled-up blueprint she had dropped into the dirt, and unrolled it flat across the top of an archival crate directly beneath the glare of the lamps. It wasn't a standard property map. It was a highly confidential internal developer schematic from 2012, detailing the illegal high-pressure greywater filtration loop that bypassed the town's environmental treatment facility, rerouting the entire community's hazardous chemical runoff directly through my historic foundation. Stuck to the corner of her map was a sheet of yellow adhesive notes detailing specific valve coordinates and a list of dates matching the upcoming municipal water main expansion. She hadn't come down here to inspect my property values. She had come down here with a crowbar to manually adjust the high-pressure overflow valves behind my false cellar wall, intending to temporarily redirect the toxic chemical trace lines away from my property before the town's ground-penetrating radar units arrived at sunrise. The silence inside the cellar was suffocating, punctuated only by the steady, heavy drip of condensation from the illegal iron water main hidden behind the stone masonry. The state inspector stepped forward, pulled a heavy, gold-embossed credential folder from his coat pocket, and laid it directly on top of her stolen blueprints. The true climax of the war, however, didn't happen in the isolation of my basement. It occurred precisely 4 hours later, at the Emergency Town Planning Board meeting inside the municipal hall. Victoria Vance had somehow managed to compose herself, arriving in a tailored gray business suit, her silver hair styled into its usual unyielding perfection. She sat at the center of the HOA board's long presentation table, her fingers typing frantically on her digital tablet, completely unaware that the three men from the cellar had spent the intervening hours filing formal injunctions with the county clerk. When the town planning director called the meeting to order to review the subdivision's infrastructure compliance certificates, Victoria took the central podium. Her voice through the microphone was smooth, professional, and entirely detached from the reality of her midnight excursion. She confidently assured the panel of town engineers that Copper Creek Estates was a model of structural integrity, completely compliant with every environmental ordinance, and that any claims of historical property infringement were the baseline delusions of a single, non-compliant resident. I didn't wait for her to finish her presentation. I stood up from the back row of the gallery, walked down the center aisle of the municipal hall, and bypassed the public comment microphone entirely. The town security guard moved to intercept me, but he stopped dead in his tracks when the state utilities inspector walked in right behind me, flanked by two uniformed county deputies carrying a formal federal subpoena. I reached the audiovisual projection desk at the side of the room, unplugged the HOA's promotional laptop from the master display feed, and inserted my own encrypted archival drive. The massive, dual projector screens behind Victoria's head instantly flickered, cutting away from her polished, colorful graphs. In their place, a giant, high-definition video loop began to play in front of the entire assembly of town officials, local reporters, and stunned neighborhood residents. The entire hall gasped collectively. On the giant screens, the absolute reality of the night was displayed in horrifying, unedited clarity. The audience watched the HOA president, the woman who had spent years bankrupting residents over lawn measurements, crawling backwards through a broken cellar hatch like a common thief, holding a crowbar and a set of forged municipal blueprints. The audio from the studio lamp's microphone captured the raw, wet sound of her gasping for air as the lights came on, followed by the crystalline image of her standing over the illegal, leaking chemical gray water manifold hidden beneath my historic home. Victoria spun around to look at the screen, her hands slamming against the edges of the wooden podium so hard the microphone let out a deafening screech of feedback. She tried to speak, to order the feed disconnected, to claim the video was an artificial fabrication, but her voice died completely in her throat. The town planning director leaned forward, his face pale with fury as he stared at the evidence of a massive, multi-million-dollar environmental fraud playing out on his own wall. He didn't ask for a vote. He picked up his heavy plastic gavel and slammed it down against the desk with a sound like a gunshot, terminating the subdivision's structural permits on the spot. Victoria stood entirely alone at the center of the room, the bright blue light of the projector screen casting the image of her own midnight face directly across her expensive gray suit. The dictator of Copper Creek Estates hadn't just lost a neighborhood dispute. She had just single-handedly triggered the total legal and structural liquidation of her entire suburban empire. The sound of the planning director's gavel did not just end the meeting. It effectively broke the spell of fear that had held Copper Creek Estates hostage for over a decade. In the immediate wake of the video disclosure, the long presentation table where the HOA board sat became a scene of absolute chaos. Board members scrambled to distance themselves from Victoria, packing away their tablets and leaving her standing entirely alone at the center podium. The local news reporters who had originally attended the meeting for a routine piece on municipal infrastructure expansion were suddenly sprinting toward the payphones and live feed vans, realizing they had just witnessed the public unraveling of a multi-million-dollar corporate and environmental conspiracy. By noon that very same day, the quiet, uniform streets of our subdivision were invaded by an armada of white state-issued utility trucks and black, unmarked SUVs belonging to the Environmental Enforcement Division. The pristine common area 3 doors down from my house, the manicured park Victoria had protected with such religious fervor, was immediately cordoned off with bright yellow hazardous materials tape. Heavy diesel generators rattled the air as state engineers began driving yellow ground-penetrating radar units across the lawns, confirming the exact subterranean map I had discovered in the county archives. Every single fine that had been levied against my property over the past 3 years was frozen by a temporary restraining order issued by a county superior court judge who looked at the video of Victoria with a crowbar and openly described it as an act of calculated domestic sabotage. The psychological shift in the neighborhood happened almost overnight. Residents who had spent years paying absurd fines for incorrect trash can placement or unapproved flower species began showing up at my front porch, not with complaints, but with baked goods, old property documents, and quiet expressions of deep gratitude. The heavy atmosphere of surveillance vanished. The quadcopter drone that had buzzed outside my bedroom window every morning at 6 o'clock was officially confiscated by the state utility inspectors as evidence of illegal corporate surveillance on an active infrastructure site. It sat inside a clear plastic evidence bag in the back of a state cruiser, its wide-angle lens pointed harmlessly at the floorboards. The true structural shockwave, however, arrived 3 weeks later during the formal title realignment proceedings in the county courthouse. As a digital archivist, I knew that old documents carried an unyielding structural weight, but even I was completely unprepared for the devastating legal conclusion reached by the state's forensic surveyors. When the original developers constructed Copper Creek Estates in 2012, they didn't just make a minor mapping mistake when they routed the high-pressure gray water filtration loop through my historic limestone basement. Because they had forged the subterranean utility disclosures to hide the infrastructure from the town planners, the entire legal description of the subdivision's master plat map was structurally flawed from its inception. The judge didn't just order the HOA to pay for the relocation of the utility lines. She looked at the verified 1884 homestead deed, which had been perfectly preserved in our family archives, and realized that the original boundary markers were tied to a series of deep limestone bedrock deposits rather than the modern asphalt roads. When those historic coordinates were converted into modern GPS telemetry, the court discovered that the developer's survey was off by exactly 24 feet along the entire eastern corridor of the valley. This meant that the physical boundary line of my private, grandfathered property didn't just slice through the neighborhood's common utility junction. It extended directly through the manicured front yards, the pristine driveways, and the actual structural foundations of the first 7 modern colonial homes on the street, including the exact property owned by Victoria Vance. The legal reality was an absolute, unpredictable masterpiece of irony. I didn't just defeat the HOA's predatory fines. By order of the Superior Court, I was suddenly the legal title holder of the land beneath my worst tormentors' feet. The houses they had built to isolate and intimidate my family homestead were technically encroaching on private historical land that had never been legally sold or transferred to the developer. The consequences for Victoria Vance were total and completely unmitigated by her expensive corporate connections. The State Utilities Commission filed a series of civil fraud charges against her personally, citing her deliberate attempt to alter state-regulated infrastructure with an industrial tool under the cover of darkness. The Environmental Protection Division tacked on 3 separate counts of hazardous waste mismanagement for allowing the high-pressure gray water filtration loop to leak into the historic limestone aquifer beneath my cellar. Her pristine, chemical-treated lawn, which she had spent years measuring with a laser to ensure its perfect conformity, was completely destroyed by the state's emergency engineering crews. Heavy excavators dug a massive, 30-foot trench directly through her front yard to physically disconnect the illegal gray water manifold from my basement wall. The sound of tearing soil and crushing plastic pipes filled the neighborhood for 2 solid weeks, a loud, industrial symphony of pure poetic justice that played outside her front windows from sunrise to sunset. Unable to afford the millions of dollars in personal civil liability and facing an imminent criminal trial for corporate malfeasance, Victoria was forced to surrender her seat on the board before filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Her house, the crown jewel of her petty suburban empire, was placed into a court-ordered receivership to pay for the massive structural reconstruction costs required to fix the neighborhood's infrastructure. The homeowners association itself was completely dissolved by judicial decree, its asset reserves wiped out by the legal fees and the massive statutory damages awarded to my family's estate for 3 years of systematic civil harassment. The white electric golf cart that Victoria had used to patrol the neighborhood like a military dictator was sold at a county sheriff's auction. It was purchased for a nominal fee by a local organic farmer who used it to haul composted manure across the valley, a fitting final chapter for the vehicle that had once carried the community's most feared administrative clipboard. Today, the valley has returned to the quiet rhythm my grandfather spent his entire life protecting. The false stone wall in my cellar has been replaced by a massive, 2-foot-thick barrier of reinforced historical masonry, paid for entirely by the developer's insurance bond. The deep limestone cavern beneath my floorboards is once again cool, dark, and silent, completely free from the toxic hiss of illegal suburban infrastructure. With the 24-foot lateral corridor officially restored to my family homestead's title, I didn't force my neighbors from their homes. Instead, I utilized the land to do exactly what the developers had tried to destroy. I tore up the uniform, chemical-treated turf grass along the encroachment zone and planted 36 new rows of heirloom apple trees, extending my grandfather's original historic orchard directly into the heart of the modern subdivision. In the springtime now, the sweet, heavy scent of apple blossoms drifts directly through the open windows of the modern colonial houses, a constant, beautiful reminder of the history that outlasted the concrete. The residents who once lived in absolute terror of Victoria's clipboard now walk their dogs down my gravel driveway, stopping to chat about the history of the valley or to help harvest the seasonal fruit that falls safely onto the grass. Standing on my front porch in the evening, looking at the tiny, matte black security camera that still sits quietly under the eaves, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the legal settlement or the public downfall of a petty neighborhood dictator. The true triumph was proving that when corporate power and artificial conformity try to erase the foundational roots of a home, a meticulous eye for detail and an unyielding commitment to the truth can turn even the smallest lens into a force that can dismantle an empire. If you are facing a toxic neighbor, an out-of-control board, or a system that tells you your rights don't matter because you don't fit their perfect mold, remember this story. They want you to panic, they want you to yield, and they want you to fight on their terms. But sometimes the best way to win a modern war is to look deep into the ancient foundation of what you are protecting, stay absolutely silent, and let the light do the work for you. Have you ever had to use a system's own rules to deliver a flawless piece of compliance?